I'm waiting for the little light. Sorry, guys. Hello, everyone. This is Paula Marie Young. I'm a professor at the Appalachian School of Law, and I am teaching a course entitled Practice Before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So this week, we're launching week 8, and I have split the webinars into 3 separate webinars. And this is the first one, and it's going to be a very short one, but it will cover the Mobile Sierra Doctrine. And one of the reasons I think the author put this chapter where it is in the book is because it leads into the California energy crisis and the market manipulation discussion. And it comes up because after that event, a number of entities, especially the state of California, entered long-term contracts with generators to try and get out of the spot market, for one thing, and have a more moderated supply, moderated in terms of price. And then later on, they realized that they had still probably paid too much for energy given the circumstances in that market, and then they were trying to get out of these contracts. And the generators, of course, were trying to invoke the Mobile Sierra Doctrine, as you'll see. So we'll go into that, and then the second part of class 22 is on the California energy crisis and a little bit on some of the types of market manipulation that went on. And that is a much lengthier webinar, but I think you're going to like it. Let me go into the webinar and we'll get at it, okay? All right, let me get my slides. All right, here we go. So as I said, this is class 22, part 1, and we're just focusing right now on the Mobile Sierra Doctrine. But let's talk about the agenda for the week. You've got 2 readings out of the course textbook, including a couple of appendices. I've got some optional stories on from Inside FERC on the California energy crisis and market manipulation up on Twin. And if they aren't up there as of Sunday, I'll get them up there very quickly. I'll also try and find some sample stories on oil pipelines and on FERC's enforcement program. I know those aren't up yet because I haven't even gotten to those slides yet. I'll either do those later tonight or I'll have to do them Monday. So we're going to have webinars, and as it turns out, we're going to have 3 as opposed to 2. You're going to have your week 8 exercise, but we are only going to have 1 speaker this week. I've tried to find somebody who can talk about the California energy crisis and market manipulation at FERC, and they aren't returning my calls. Admittedly, I started looking kind of late in the game, but it could be that they're just reluctant to talk about this at this point, particularly since litigation is still pending. But we are going to have a speaker. She will appear on Friday. This is Dan Watkiss' wife, Carol Clayton. She is one of my best friends in the world, and she has served as partner in charge of the Washington, D.C. office and chair of the environmental practice group of WilmerHale. She also represented BP on the environmental claims in connection with the Gulf spill. So she's a very, very talented lawyer, and I think you'll enjoy her presentation. She may be joined by someone else who's going to be talking more about how the EPA's regulations translate into the electric energy field. And we're going to be talking about EPA's Clean Power Plan. As part of that, I have reposted that really short article that I posted when we were talking about natural gas. I've reposted it here so you can look at it if you want to get just a general gist of what that topic is now that we're really applying it on the electric side. Okay, so jumping right in. Under the Natural Gas Act and the Federal Power Act, FERC requires regulated companies to file copies of their service agreements containing rates, terms, and conditions of service. So they not only have their tariffs that are filed with the FERC, but then if they enter any individual contracts, then they also have to file those. And this is all about creating more transparency and also ensuring that service is provided without undue discrimination. Now, FERC has two choices in terms of how they treat these service contracts. They might be subject to modification under the just and reasonable standard, or they could be deemed sacrosanct and immune from regulation. Excuse me. I've just popped a cough drop in my mouth, so you may hear me kind of playing with that. All right, so if they choose this latter option, it's because they have assumed that these are free market contracts, or at least contracts that are negotiated between primarily very sophisticated parties. And so there's really no reason to second guess whether or not they're just and reasonable, however that term gets interpreted. So there were two landmark cases before the U.S. Supreme Court: United Gas Pipeline Company v. Mobile Gas Service Corp. So that's where the mobile comes from. And then FPC versus Sierra Pacific Power Company, which is where the Sierra came from. And you'll see that they're decided in the same year. So in the first case, mobile, a natural gas pipeline contracted with a local distribution company to supply gas at a fixed rate for the term of the contract. Now, this is the important part: fixed rate for the term of the contract. The pipeline filed to increase the rate even though the contract had not expired, and they filed under Section 4, which is the section that pipelines use to initiate changes. The Federal Power Commission allowed the change. The Supreme Court on review said that Section 4 of the NGA does not give a pipeline the unilateral right to change contractually agreed rates. And they were concerned about the stability of contracts that are important to the industry, but they indicated that the commission could act under Section 5, but that was the only way that it could act, and would only do so if a change in the rate was required by the public interest. Now, we shift over to the electricity side. And in Sierra, a public utility who is also a generator, so this is a vertically integrated firm, agreed to sell at wholesale electricity under a long-term contract at a fixed rate. So again, we've got long-term contract, fixed rate. It applied to increase the rate under Section 205 of the Federal Power Act before the contract expired. So you can see very parallel situations. FPA allowed it. Apparently this is before the Natural Gas Act case had come down, or maybe they felt like they had different authority under the Federal Power Act. The Supreme Court, relying on mobile, held that the utility could not unilaterally change the rate under Section 205. Also, the Supreme Court held that the FPC could not change the rate under the just and reasonable standard of Section 206 of the FPA. So, we're getting some deeper thinking now about this. The court said that the contract is not unreasonable simply because it yields less than a fair return on the invested capital. The utility can agree by contract to enter a contract that does not produce an expected profit. It cannot be later relieved of that improvident bargain. So one of the things they're doing is they're saying, this is not unjust and unreasonable just because you didn't get your profit expectation met. The FPA or FPC may only consider if a rate is so low as to adversely affect the public interest, as it might impair the financial ability of the public utility to continue service, cast upon other consumers an excessive burden, or be unduly discriminatory. And Section 206A does protect the public interest and not the private interest of utilities. So you have to find this confluence of interest before a contract is going to be deemed subject to change because of a public interest. All right, so what happened after this? And let's look first at the natural gas industry. So pipelines began modifying their service agreements to set gas prices in rate schedules they could update as prices fluctuated. And this obviously becomes very important later on when gas prices really began to escalate. They would file a Section 4 rate case to get the new rate schedules approved. And the Supreme Court approved the process in a 1959 case called the United Gas Pipeline Company versus Memphis Light Gas and Water Division. And the clauses then became known as Memphis clauses. And it shifted the natural gas industry from a rate schedule industry to a tariff and service agreement industry. And the shift was to system-wide tariffs that established terms and conditions of service and rates for different classes of customers. But then they would use service agreements with standardized language that referred to the tariff rates and contained the Memphis clauses. So basically, they're preserving their right in the contract to file a Section 4 case. That's basically what they're doing. And it becomes a contractual agreement that the pipeline can file that rate case. Okay, to protect multi-party settlements filed and approved by the Commission, parties frequently provided that the settlement contracts could not be modified unless FERC later found them to harm the public interest. And you want to see, that's, this goes back to that black box settlement process. After all the parties come together and manage to carve out an agreement on what the rate's going to be, you don't want that to be unstable because it's an intensive process. And the book notes that the public interest standard is very high, practically insurmountable in the context of individual contracts. All right, now let's look at the electric industry. What did they do? Well, they did not convert to a tariff and service agreement approach until FERC order number 888 in 1996. And that's partly because the industry is going through a very different timeline for deregulation. And at that point, they were still operating under a bundled sale and service model. So at this point, providers have several options. They could enter a fixed rate contract subject to modification by FERC under NGA Section 5 or FPA Section 206A if the public interest required it. They could contract with a Memphis clause allowing the provider to seek a rate change under NGA Section 4 or FPA Section 205, or they could create a contract in which the parties agree that the provider could impose new rates unilaterally and immediately, subject to FERC suspension for the specified time and disallowance under applicable standards. So this is kind of pre-granted rate changes. And the DC Circuit said that was okay. And the US Supreme Court decided not to look at it. So you know which ones the providers are going to gravitate to. It's going to be this one. All right, so the doctrine was very durable until the Ninth Circuit tried to rewrite it after the California energy crisis. So the court sought to extend relief from long-term bilateral contracts to the purchasers under those contracts, which were primarily state agencies who stepped in when the public utilities became insolvent. And we'll talk about this in the next webinar. The court asserted that the doctrine did not apply to contracts entered into under FERC's market-based regime if FERC had not reviewed the contract to determine if the rates were just and reasonable. Remember that FERC is regulating the wholesale sales market. Even if FERC had reviewed the rates, the public interest standard required the requested relief, And the court asserted that purchasers under these contracts could abrogate them could abrogate the contracts and establish new rates where the existing rates fell outside a zone of reasonableness. Now, when I saw this, I thought, this isn't going anywhere. First of all, how can you suddenly create this zone of reasonableness standard, which is nowhere in the two statutes? All right. So, big surprise. Doctrine is bolstered by the Supreme Court, reversed many of the key holdings, but affirmed two key holdings and then remanded. So this is a case, it was decided in 2008, and it was the first review of the doctrine in over 50 years. So the Supreme Court clarified only one standard applies, just and reasonable, not a public interest one, for evaluating contracts. Now, here they're showing even deeper thinking, it seems to me. FERC must assume that freely negotiated contracts are just and reasonable. And in a way, that goes back to that arrow that I had. They're sacrosanct because, to a great extent, because they're negotiated between sophisticated parties who should be able to protect themselves. And so there is some expectation that those rates reflect just and reasonable pricing. However, the presumption that they are just and reasonable can be overcome by a showing that the contracts harm the public interest. So that's how the public interest evaluation comes in. And that's consistent with what we have talked about. And then there were three factors identified in Sierra that this court said are not exclusive. I'd have to go back and figure out what those were. But anyway, in addition, contracts can be set aside for fraud or duress, and the public interest is not coincident with a contract that exceeds marginal cost. So basically, they're just, again, saying it's not coincident with you making a profit. All right. The Supreme Court also held that the presumption applies regardless of when FERC reviews the contract. It reversed the Ninth Circuit's holding that the public interest standard could not apply if FERC had not reviewed the contract before it became effective. I hope I wrote that right. There's too many knots in there. At any rate, moving on. Explained that the market might be dysfunctional at the time the parties entered the long-term agreement, but that the dysfunction did not allow abrogation of a contract designed to minimize risks of that market. So we're going to hear about this a lot in the next webinar. These were used as hedges against the spot market. So you still might be paying inflated prices, but it was still less than what you were paying in the spot market. And the court rejected the Ninth Circuit's dual standard for buyers and sellers, held that the same public interest standard applies to both parties. Now, I didn't summarize anything about that earlier, so don't worry about it. And again, protected the stability of contracts as an important consumer value. The Supreme Court agreed that FERC must determine whether a contract violates the public interest, not just at the time of execution of the contract, but down the line at the point in time the contract is challenged. And the presumption that the contract is just and reasonable does not apply if one party to the contract has manipulated the market to such an extent that it altered the playing field. Now, that would have to be the person with whom you have contracted, not somebody else who's manipulated the market in a way that's inflated prices. But the causal connection must exist between the market manipulation and the challenged contract rates. And then the Supreme Court remanded these three issues so that the Ninth Circuit could further consider them. All right, then we've got another case. Let me look at this. Yeah, okay. So the Maine Public Utilities Commission and Attorneys General of Connecticut and Massachusetts filed consolidated petitions for review of orders of the FERC approving a comprehensive settlement that redesigned New England's capacity market pursuant to the FPA. So this is electricity. The Court of Appeals held that, this is a DC circuit, in a matter of first impression, the Mobile Sierra Doctrine did not apply to non-settling third parties. Yikes. Parties that did not execute a settlement agreement were not bound by the public interest standard. Instead, the Commission must apply the traditional just and reasonable standard if they challenge the rates established by the settlement. True, too, if FERC wants to modify a settlement on its own motion under Section 206A, I think it is. And here's the name of the case. Here's when it came down. Now, this is the last thing that our textbook reports. And when I saw this, I thought there's no way that this survived appeal. And the reason that I thought that is that by making a distinction between settling and non-settling parties, they were inviting people not to settle these cases or not to enter settlements. And that I just couldn't see being a public policy that the Supreme Court would want to support. So guess what? Reversed in part. Here's the case, 2010. The part on which they reversed is that the Mobile Sierra presumption is not limited to challenges to contract rates brought only by the contracting parties, but applies as well to challenges initiated by non-contracting parties. So it applies to everyone. And the bottom line is those contracts are going to be deemed just and reasonable. That presumption can only be overcome in a fairly limited circumstances that really indicate that the public interest versus private interests are being affected. All right. Next class, California energy crisis and the market manipulation. So that's all I've got in that one. I'll see you in the next one. That one's really good. So you'll have it. You'll really enjoy it. I promise. I promise. All right. Bye.